Good afternoon, dear subscribers of the Ruslan Belov channel. We present to your attention the daily review of the situation on the line of combat confrontation from the Ukrainian side. New negotiation processes are beginning in Geneva today. Am I counting on significant progress? Naturally no. What kind of breakthrough can there be? Unless Zelensky makes the decision, I agree, I am giving the command to the Ukrainian armed forces to leave the territories that are required to be liberated. However, he stated his categorical refusal to do this under any circumstances. In that case, what breakthrough can one hope for? Nothing more. Consequently, the meeting will take place, negotiations will occur. Perhaps they will agree on the next prisoner exchange, but unlikely anything more than that. The combat situation remains tense, and we continue to analyze what is happening. Dear viewers, many changes were recorded over the past day. To understand the scale, changes occurred simultaneously on 11 front sectors. More precisely, even more. I simply combined some sectors into one, since they relate to one direction, but in reality there were changes on 17 sections. I have not observed anything like this before. Moreover, it is worth noting, only on 2 sectors was the advance on the side of Ukrainian forces, everything else in Russia's favor. But let's move to sequential analysis, moving from northern areas to southern ones. But first, recordings came from the Kharkiv region, demonstrating how Russian drones detected Ukrainian armed forces infantry moving across snowy terrain. The servicemen noticed the drones and tried to hide, but how can you run away when the snow cover reaches your knee? No way, movement is difficult, it is impossible to run fast. They could not and died. Moving to the results of the past day. Let's start with the Sumy region. There were many advances here. First of all, on the recently created Kharkiv bridgehead. Here, servicemen of the North grouping continued to increase the territory of the bridgehead. In the western part, they advanced a kilometer and entered the border village of Kharkivka. The eastern sector of the settlement is now under Russian control. Considering the compact size of the settlement and its location at the border, I believe that soon the village will completely come under Russian control, about which we will also receive information. In the eastern sector, advancement was also recorded. Here, smaller in distance, 550 meters, movement went along the Klavan River with the capture of part of a forest section. As a result, the length of the Kharkiv bridgehead now totals 15 kilometers. However, here we would like to observe movement not only in width along the borderline, but also deep into the territory, to give the bridgehead greater stability. At the moment, the maximum depth is 2 kilometers, which is clearly insufficient. If we consider the main Sumy bridgehead, changes also occurred there. Advancement was recorded in 4 positions. North of Kondratovka, they advanced 900 meters, continuing to encircle the settlement. Plus, from the eastern direction, they advanced a kilometer, entered Kondratovka, and fortified on the outermost street. Also from Andreevka, they advanced 400 meters along the forest belt in the southern direction. And from Alexeyevka to the south, they advanced a kilometer, reaching the approaches of the village of Malaya Korchakovka. From current positions to it is approximately a kilometer, that is, completely close. As can be seen, there are no truly large-scale movements, but there are several small advances, which in total give more than 2 square kilometers of captured area. And an interesting point. If we recall the summer counter-offensive actions of the armed forces of Ukraine, in July-August, they extremely actively counterattacked here in the Sumy region. Zelensky in August generally promised that by mid-October, I don't remember exactly. By the beginning or mid-October, Russian troops would be completely expelled from the entire Sumy region. So from the territories that they managed to recapture during the summer counterattacks, under their control remained only the recaptured Kondratovka, which they will obviously lose in the near future, because the configuration of the front line is such that holding Kondratovka is impossible. Thus, all their achievements have already been nullified. And now the North grouping is reaching new lines. The village of Malaya Korchakovka, to the approaches of which they came out, just represents such a new line, since further there is a highway, and there are already 13 kilometers to Sumy. In general, the command of the armed forces of Ukraine transferred forces from here for their new offensive in the Zaporizhzhia region. Well, and here is the result. For February in the Sumy region, the Russian side will have quite good indicators. Since also on the Grabovsky bridgehead there were movements. First, they cleared forest sections between the villages of Pogrovka and Popovka, thus connecting positions. Plus, south of Grabovsky, they advanced 4.5 kilometers, also capturing forest belts and massifs. And now the length of the Grabovsky bridgehead is 20 kilometers, and the maximum depth is 4 kilometers. We continue further, to the Kharkiv region. There were also many movements there, though not only by the Russian army, but about everything in order. Recently, the Lipetsk direction has become active and continues to demonstrate activity. After the capture of the village of Zeleno, entry occurred into the neighboring village of Neskuchnoye. Fighting is currently underway there. It is premature to make far-reaching conclusions yet, since significant progress can be discussed in the case if the Russian army takes Neskuchnoye, from it advances further and enters the large village of Veseloye, which adjoins the reservoir, and occupies Veseloye. Then indeed, it will be possible to say that indeed, the section has come alive, played with new colors, and there are serious prospects there. But for now we just observe. For now there are small movements, but there is no talk of any turning point. On the former Volchansky direction, and now probably it is more correct to call it the Staro-Saltovskoye direction, there were movements to the northwest of Staritsa. Here they advanced in forest massifs by 2 kilometers, even a bit more than 2 kilometers. But in this section, this forest plays a key role. It is not small, and there are many strong points there. And if it is taken under control, especially by the time greenery appears, then indeed here we will see serious changes. On the eastern coast of the Seversky Donets, it was possible to capture most of Gravskoye and clear the pocket between it and Simonovka. The armed forces of Ukraine still hold the southern part of Gravskoye, but not for long. What else? In Volchansky Khutora, in the northern part of the village, there were small movements. However, here advances are given extremely hard, and we approach the section of advancement of the armed forces of Ukraine. I will note one point. This was not over the past day, but over several weeks, even it can be said, over several months. On the Malovsky bridgehead, they managed to push back Russian positions from the Verkhnaya Dvurachanaya river closer to Melovoye. Now updates just arrived, more precisely, clarifications on the location of the Russian line of combat contact, and therefore on the map here, such a large-scale section was repainted. What can be said here? Now it is clear why over all these months it was not possible to reach Kutnay, although it seemed that we are very close to it. We move further, on the Kupiansk and Borovsky directions for the past day without news. But on the Lyman direction, there were movements both by the Russian army and by the armed forces of Ukraine. The armed forces of Ukraine returned to themselves part of the positions north of the urban-type settlement of Drobyshevo. But at the same time, they missed a strike to the northeast. And thanks to this, Russian servicemen managed to enter the settlement and fortify on the street adjacent to the cemetery. As I said earlier, the urban-type settlement of Drobyshevo is a very tough nut, and battles on the approaches to it have lasted for several months already. But now battles have begun already directly inside it. It will definitely not be easy, but the capture of this urban-type settlement will actually put an end to the defense of Lyman for the armed forces of Ukraine. We continue further. On the Kramatorsk direction, the expected happened. Servicemen of the South grouping completed the capture of the most difficult defensive node. We are talking about Minkovka. Now it remains to capture Golubovka and the entire fortified area of the armed forces of Ukraine, which was created around 3 settlements. These are Orekovo, Vasilyevka, Minkovka, and Golubovka, will be under Russian control. The battle for both Slavyansk and Kramatorsk is approaching, and moreover, already tangibly approaching. And the last advance recorded in the past day is south of Grishino. Servicemen of the center grouping advanced on a section with a length of 2 kilometers 300 meters. In Grishino itself, fierce battles continue for now. But I will say this, it seems a turning point is emerging, and a turning point in Russia's favor. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but there are simply some positive signals from there. I am informing you about them. In general, summing up the past day, we have the following. Due to changes on the Malovsky bridgehead, due to clarification of the line of combat contact there, the armed forces of Ukraine have advancement of 15 square kilometers, and under the control of the Russian army for the past day, past 35 square kilometers. As for the offensive of the armed forces of Ukraine in the Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhzhia regions, in recent days it is obvious that it has gone into decline. It is too early to assert that the offensive has ended, since no, it has not ended. Attacks continue. It's just that these attacks have become fewer. They have become less large-scale and less intensive. For understandable reasons, actually. Over 8 days of their offensive, the armed forces of Ukraine lost more than 100 units of equipment and more than 1,000 of their servicemen. Therefore, attacking with the previous intensity and previous forces does not work out for them. However, I will also note that it is too early to relax, therefore we continue observation. On the Gulyapol section, the armed forces of Ukraine continue to counterattack in the area of Zhelezhnodorozhnoye and Starukranka. Battles for Krynichnye continue. Higher on the map, the Ukrainian army tried to occupy Priluki for further crossing of the Gaichur River. The armed forces of the Russian Federation hold the lines and do not allow groups of the armed forces of Ukraine beyond the river. In Ternovatoye and Kosovtsevo, there are meeting battles. Both villages are in the grey zone. The armed forces of the Russian Federation strike the armed forces of Ukraine in Boykovo, Rozdestvenskoye, Vozdvizhenka, inflicting significant damage. On the western Zaporizhzhia section, heavy battles continue on the northeastern outskirts of Primorskoye. Subdivisions of the armed forces of Ukraine are trying to penetrate in small groups to restore presence and lost positions. However, Russian troops timely detect and neutralize such attempts. The Ukrainian side also continues counterattacks in the area of Rekhnoye. According to the Ministry of Defense of Russia, the settlements of Magdalinovka and Zapasnoye passed under Russian control. Contradictory information is coming here. A number of sources report that according to data from the field, information about the capture of control over Magdalinovka and Zapasnoye is premature. The armed forces of Ukraine maintain their presence there. At the same time, attempts by the armed forces of Ukraine to consolidate in the areas of Lukyanovsky and Novoboykovskoye are recorded, as well as counterattacks on the eastern outskirts of Novoyakovlevka and Pavlovka. Individual groups of the armed forces of Ukraine apparently tried to approach Malye Sherbaki. The situation remains tense. The Ukrainian army continues to pull reserves to strongpoints on the second and third lines of defense and regularly undertakes counteractions. Further advancement of the Russian army toward the direction of Yurkovka and Tavricheskoye, necessary for encircling the Orakovsky fortified area from the west, will be difficult without clearing positions to the west of Novoyakovlevka and Pavlovka. Breaking through the third line of defense south of Kamishevaka represents an even more difficult task, but nevertheless the main role of the counteroffensive of the armed forces of Ukraine has been stopped. The armed forces of the Russian Federation delivered combined strikes on targets in 8 regions of Ukraine. The most powerful strikes were on Kiev and Zaporizhzhia. In Kiev, they report hits on the Kievska 750 substation, a key energy facility of the Kiev energy ring, and a number of other energy facilities. In Zaporizhzhia, there were fires and interruptions in water supply were recorded. In the Poltava region, a strong fire occurred at an oil depot in Kachanovo. In Konotop, they also hit energy infrastructure. There were power outages. And Dmitriev stated that in Munich they did not notice the trail of corruption around Zelensky. The special representative of the President of Russia pointed to the demonstrative silence about corruption in Zelensky's entourage at the Munich Security Conference. On the eve of negotiations in Geneva, one of Zelensky's closest advisors, featured in the Golden Toilet case, was detained while attempting to flee to Poland. In Munich, Dmitriev notes, no one publicly asked Zelensky questions about the condemned entourage. The assessment of corruption associated with the war in Ukraine, according to him, reaches $50 billion, a sum comparable to the budgets of entire countries. By the way, the scene with the ignoring of Macron in Munich is a symptom of Europe's deep crisis, writes Berliner Zeitung. The German publication called the incident at the Munich Security Conference one of the most symbolic scenes of the forum. During a joint press conference with British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, French President Macron tried several times to greet German Chancellor Friedrich Merz. Merz did not react to the greeting. It looked as if he was demonstratively ignoring the French president. This scene looks like a snapshot of what many are saying behind closed doors. Franco-German relations, long considered the engine of Europe, are in deep crisis, the publication notes. Europe's worst poker face was shown by Callas in Munich. The expression on her face, according to the publication, became a symbol of Europe's irritation and dissatisfaction with US policy. Callas pursed her lips and puffed her cheeks at the moment when the US permanent representative to the UN, Mike Waltz, was talking about Washington's successes in ending wars. Salami tactics, in game theory, is called what the US and Europe are doing with Russia's so-called shadow fleet, a strategy in which a large goal is replaced by a sequence of small intermediate goals. Like cutting off little by little from a stick of sausage, writes Oleg Tsarev. Today, an inspection of a tanker and verification. Tomorrow, short-term detention. The day after tomorrow, arrest of cargo. Then it's sale and arrest or trial of the crew. And each next step already looks normal because the previous one worked. Even the most formidable verbal responses work poorly against this. The only working option is to give a tough and inevitable response, and such that it is obviously more expensive than the provocation itself and sharply raises its price. As I wrote earlier, finding what such a response might be is a non-trivial task. Yes, there will be a retaliatory reaction and most likely one sharp test episode, but this is better than chronic attacks on our fleet for years. It's like in the schoolyard, a bully goes where it's safe and without response. As soon as he understands that he has messed with someone who fights back, he retreats and switches to others, to those who don't fight back, wrote Oleg Tsarev. The EU is preparing for a complete naval blockade of Russia. Ursula von der Leyen emphasized that sanctions, according to the European Commission's assessment, supposedly work. The 20th package of sanctions provides for tightening the fight against circumventing sanctions, including tankers. Separately, a complete ban on maritime transportation in synchronization with the G7 and the US is being discussed. The West is beginning practical implementation of the plan and is doing everything openly, before our eyes, not afraid. They will also calmly and businesslike proceed to seize Russian vessels, writes about this Oleg Tsarev. The threat of a naval blockade of oil trade is becoming increasingly tangible. If Britain, at the head of a coalition of a number of countries, begins to massively detain shadow fleet tankers in the Baltic direction and sell oil from them, this will seriously hit budget revenues. In such a situation, the main question is, what set of retaliatory actions does Russia have left at all, and how realistic is it? A forceful response in the format of convoys in the Baltic looks extremely difficult. There are few surface forces, part of the ships are in the Black Sea, and the convoy scheme requires constant presence and rotation. The same ships can escort one convoy, after which they must urgently return for the next one. Continuous protection cannot be created this way. Even if tankers are brought out under convoy further entering the Atlantic, they will already be vulnerable to interception without cover.